In 1903, a French colonial survey team crossed into the southern Algerian Sahara on a mapping expedition that was supposed to last 6 weeks. They came back after 11. 2 of the surveyors were dead. One was in a sanitarium in Marseille within a year. And the report they filed, a 340-page document with photographic plates, geological cross-sections, and hand-drawn measurements, was printed in a limited run of 200 copies and then quietly removed from every public library it had been distributed to. The reason given at the time was that the report contained measurement errors that needed to be corrected. The corrected version never appeared. What the surveyors had found scattered across an area roughly the size of Belgium were petrified tree trunks. Not unusual on its own. Petrified wood exists across the Sahara and has been documented for centuries, but these were different. The diameter of the largest specimen they recorded was 42 meters. That is 138 feet across. A single tree trunk wider than most city blocks in Paris, wider than the entire span of the Arc de Triomphe. And they did not find one. They catalogued 47 of them. Today, almost no one outside of a small circle of researchers has ever heard of this survey. The original copies are scattered, 3 known to exist in private collections, and the photographs are believed to have been destroyed in a fire at the Bibliothèque de l'Institut Géographique in 1962. A fire that, conveniently, only damaged the colonial-era archive room and left every other section untouched. This is the story of what those surveyors found, why the official explanation makes no scientific sense, and why a forgotten 1903 expedition might be the single most important piece of evidence for a theory that mainstream history refuses to acknowledge. The theory that we are not the first advanced civilization to walk this planet. If you want more videos like this, the ones investigating the things that don't fit the official timeline, hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell. We post deep dives into forbidden history, lost civilizations and Tartaria research every week. Now let's get into it. To understand why the 1903 survey matters, we need to start with what the Sahara actually is. The image people carry of it, endless dunes, a desert that has always been a desert, is wrong. The Sahara was green, not millions of years ago, within human history. Roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, the region we now call the Sahara was a savanna. There were lakes, rivers, forests. Hippos lived in what is now central Algeria. Cattle herders left rock paintings showing scenes that look more like the Serengeti than the dust-choked plain that exists there today. This is called the African humid period. But here is what the textbook version does not explain. The forests that died in the Sahara during that period were not made up of trees that could grow 42 meters in diameter. The largest trees that grew in that region were acacia, baobab relatives, and various drought-resistant hardwoods. None of them gets anywhere close to the size of what the 1903 survey documented. The largest tree currently living on Earth, General Sherman in California, is about 11 meters in diameter at the base. The trees Marchand documented were, on average, 3 to 4 times larger than anything currently alive on the planet. So what were those trees? When did they grow? And how did they end up petrified, lying flat across a region the size of Belgium, in patterns that, according to the surveyor's own diagrams, suggested they had been deliberately felled? The expedition was led by a man named Etienne Marchand. He was 38 years old, a graduate of the École Polytechnique, with a decade of field experience mapping French colonial territories. He was not a fringe figure. He was a hard-nosed surveyor with a reputation for precision. His expedition included a geologist named Paul Renard, a photographer named Henri Vasseur, and a team of 12 local guides recruited from Tuareg communities. They departed in late March of 1903. For the first 3 weeks, the expedition went exactly as planned. Marchand's notes from this period are routine, almost boring. Then, on the morning of April 19th, 1903, one of the Tuareg guides led Marchand and Renard to a site that the locals called, in their language, the place of the giants who fell. Marchand initially assumed this was a folktale. The guide said it was real, that he had been there as a boy, and that white men had not seen it before because no white man had ever asked the right question. What Marchand wrote in his journal that evening is one of the few passages from the expedition that has been quoted in subsequent research. He described approaching what he initially thought was a rock formation, a series of long parallel ridges running across the desert floor. As he got closer, he realized the ridges were too uniform, too straight, and the surface texture was wrong. Bark, petrified bark, visible in cross-section where the formation had cracked. He was looking at a tree lying on its side, partially buried in sand, but exposed enough that he could measure it. He paced the diameter at the thickest section. Then he had Renard measure it independently. The two measurements agreed within a metre of each other. 31 metres across, at the base. That was the first one. Renard later recalled that Marchand was pale, and that when he finally stood up, the only thing he said was a single sentence in French. Translated, it reads, "We have found something that should not exist." Over the next 4 days, the Tuareg guide led the expedition to 13 more, some smaller, some larger. The largest, the 42-metre specimen, was found half buried in a depression that the guide indicated had once been a lake. According to local oral tradition, the tree had not fallen there. It had been moved. The guide told Marchand that the legend was older than any of the local tribes, older than Islam. His grandfather had told him that the giants who once walked the world had used these trees for something the modern people no longer understood. Now, the skeptical reading of all this is that Marchand was either deluded, lying, or measuring something that was not actually a tree. Maybe these were unusual rock formations. Maybe his measurements were wrong. Here is the problem with that reading. Renard, the geologist, filed an independent report. His report agreed with Marchand's measurements. The photographer, Vasseur, took plates of the formations, and at least 3 of those plates were reproduced in the original 1903 publication before it was withdrawn. 2 of those reproductions still exist, scanned by a researcher named Jean-Claude Beaumont in the late 1980s. The photographs show what appear to be petrified tree trunks of enormous size, with a human figure included for scale in 2 of the images. The figure is barely visible. He is standing at the base of the trunk, and he comes up to about 1/15 of its diameter. That is not a rock formation. That is not a measurement error. That is a tree that should not exist. So, what is mainstream science's explanation for these objects? There is no mainstream explanation, because mainstream science does not acknowledge that they exist. The 1903 report was withdrawn. The photographs were destroyed. The site has either been buried by shifting sand or, in the more controversial accounts, has been deliberately covered. There are claims, unverified but persistent, that French colonial authorities sent a follow-up expedition in 1907 with explosives, and that the expedition destroyed the largest specimens before sealing what remained under sand. Why would they do that? The answer, if you accept the framework that researchers in the Tartaria field have been working with for the past 2 decades, is that the discovery did not fit the official narrative of human history. By 1903, that narrative had already been established, codified, taught in universities, and was being aggressively defended against any evidence that contradicted it. To understand why this matters, we have to talk about Tartaria. Tartaria, or Great Tartary as it appears on dozens of European maps from the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, was a vast region covering most of what is now Russia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and parts of China. The first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in 1771, describes it as the largest empire in the world by land area. The same entry is significantly shorter in the second edition, removed entirely by the third, and by the fourth edition, Tartary has vanished from the encyclopedia altogether. Then, sometime in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Tartaria disappears from the maps. It does not get conquered, it does not break up into successor states, it simply vanishes from the cartographic record. The Tartaria research community points to the consistency of the term across multiple centuries and multiple cartographic traditions. They point to the architectural anomalies scattered across the former Tartarian territory, structures that appear to predate the civilizations officially credited with building them, structures whose construction methods do not match the technological capacities of the populations supposedly responsible. This is where the petrified trees come in. If the Tartaria framework is correct, and there was a global civilization that predated the one we know about, a civilization that was deliberately erased from the historical record, then the question is not whether evidence of that civilization exists, The question is where the evidence has been hidden, suppressed, or destroyed. The 1903 Sahara survey fits the pattern almost perfectly. The trees Marchand documented were not local Sahara species. The size alone rules that out. There is no botanical lineage in the African fossil record that produces trees of those dimensions. So either we have a previously unknown species that grew nowhere else and left no other fossil record, or we have something stranger. Trees that did not grow there, trees that were brought there, trees that were used for some purpose then abandoned. Some Tartaria researchers argue that the petrified trunks Marchand found were the remnants of a massive infrastructure project, a harvested resource possibly used in construction. The Tuareg legend that the trees were moved is consistent with this. The pattern of the trunks across the desert, lying parallel, in regular spacing, is consistent with this. The depression where the largest specimen was found, the ancient lake bed, is consistent with the idea that the trees were transported by water before being abandoned. If you find this hard to swallow, you are not alone. There is no civilization in the official record that had the capacity to harvest, transport, and arrange trees of 40-meter diameter. The whole proposition requires accepting that everything we have been taught about pre-Roman engineering capacity is wrong by orders of magnitude. But that is exactly what the Tartaria framework proposes. Marchand's expedition continued for another 3 months after the initial discovery. They documented additional sites. They mapped the distribution of the trunks across an area Marchand estimated at roughly 30,000 square kilometers. They noted that the larger specimens were always found in association with what looked like artificial earthworks, mounds, channels, geometric depressions in the desert floor that did not match any natural erosion pattern. 2 of his expedition members died during the return journey. The cause of death was officially listed as exposure and exhaustion. Renard, in a private 1908 letter, discovered in a French provincial archive in 1979, wrote that he believed they had been poisoned. Vasseur, the photographer, returned to France and within 8 months was committed to a sanitarium in Marseille. He died there in 1911. His family destroyed his personal papers after his death, on the instructions of an authority Renard's letter does not name. Marchand himself lived until 1934. He never spoke publicly about the expedition again. In private correspondence, he expressed regret that the report had been suppressed and conviction that what they had found was genuine. In a letter dated 1919, he wrote that he had been warned by parties he would not name in writing that revisiting the topic would have consequences for his family. The site itself has been reportedly visited by at least 3 subsequent expeditions in 1932, 1958, and 1987. The 1987 expedition, led by an independent French geologist named Lucien Petit, claimed to have located what may have been one of the smaller petrified trunks. Petit took photographs. He filed a preliminary report. Within a year, he was dismissed from his university position. The photographs were taken from his home during a burglary in 1989. He died in 1994. The official cause was a heart attack. He was 51 years old and had no history of cardiac problems. The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. The primary evidence is too fragmented, too damaged, too contested. What we have are the surviving fragments of Marchand's report, the testimony of Renard, 2 reproduced photographs, and a pattern of suppression that, even if it does not prove the underlying claim, is itself worth investigating. If Marchand's trees exist, they tell us one of 3 things. They tell us that there is a previously unknown species of giant tree that grew in the Sahara and left no other fossil record. They tell us that the trees were transported there from somewhere else. Or they tell us that the entire timeline is wrong, and there were forests in the Sahara, with trees of dimensions that exceed anything in the modern botanical record, in a period of geological time that is not currently recognized. Each of these possibilities is devastating to the mainstream narrative. The first requires us to accept significant gaps in our paleobotanical record. The second requires a civilization with the engineering capacity to move trees weighing hundreds of thousands of tons. The third requires us to accept that the geological history of the planet includes periods that current science does not acknowledge. This is why the report was suppressed, not because the trees did not exist, because they did, and because their existence raised questions that the institutional structures of early 20th century science were not prepared to answer. For more than a century, that strategy has worked, but the question remains. And the trees, if they existed, are still there, buried under the sand, waiting for someone with the resources and the political access to dig them up. Were we the first? Or did someone else come before us, build something we do not understand, leave behind evidence we are not equipped to interpret, and then disappear from the record so completely that even their existence is now disputed? The Sahara might know. The 1903 survey almost told us. Until then, we have Marchand's notes, Renard's letter, 2 surviving photographs, and a 42-metre petrified tree trunk lying somewhere in the southern Algerian desert, half buried in sand, waiting for the next person willing to look. If you want to dig deeper into the lost histories the textbooks refuse to acknowledge, we have a full playlist of investigations into Tartaria, suppressed archaeology, and the civilizations that mainstream science has tried to erase. Watch the next video right now. The evidence is on the screen.